The polished toe of her $3,000 stiletto connected with the plastic cup, sending a spray of copper coins into the gutter, but as the old man looked up, the air in the city seemed to vanish, because in his eyes she didn't see a stranger, she saw the ghost of the father she had buried 20 years ago. The sky over the city was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with the promise of a storm that didn't care about the schedules of the elite. Clara von Heisig checked her Patek Philippe, 3:14 p.m. She was 6 minutes late for the board meeting that would decide the fate of the historic East Side district. To Clara, the district was just a collection of square footage and obsolete structures. To her, people were much the same. Before we continue this incredible journey of redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this story and others like it challenge everything you think you know about the human heart. Clara strode across the marble lobby of Platinum Plaza, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of her heels sounding like a countdown. She was a woman of sharp angles, sharp suit, sharp bob, and a mind that functioned like a high-frequency trading algorithm. She didn't see the doorman's nod, she didn't see the florist's smile. She saw only the glass revolving doors and the black town car idling at the curb. But between her and the car sat an obstacle. He was a smudge on her pristine reality. The old man, Elias, sat hunched against the cold granite pillar of the building. He wore a coat that had seen so many winters the fabric had forgotten its original color. Beside him was a violin case, open but empty of music, and a small blue plastic cup containing exactly 3 quarters and a nickel. Clara's phone buzzed in her hand. Her assistant was frantic. The investors were restless. The obstacle in the hallway of her life was an old man whose presence felt like a personal insult to the luxury she had built. As she neared him, the first heavy drops of rain began to crater the pavement. Elias didn't hold out his hand. He didn't beg. He simply sat there, his eyes fixed on a small laminated photograph tucked into the lid of his violin case. Clara's path was clear, but the crowd of tourists had bottlenecked near the door. To get through, she would have to step around the beggar. In her mind, he wasn't a man. He was a symptom of a city she intended to clean up. "Move," she hissed, the word barely audible over the rising wind. Elias didn't move. He was humming, a low melodic vibration that seemed to grate against Clara's nerves like sandpaper on silk. It was a tune she hadn't heard in decades, a lullaby that smelled of wood smoke and cheap peppermint. The coincidence of the melody fueled her irritation. It felt like a trap. It felt like a memory trying to claw its way out of the cellar of her mind where she had locked it away. "I said move," she barked, her voice now drawing the eyes of the commuters. Elias looked up then. His eyes were a startling, piercing gray, clouded by cataracts but shining with a strange, lucid intensity. He didn't look at her suit. He looked directly into her pupils as if searching for a room he used to live in. Then it happened. As he shifted to draw his legs in, his foot accidentally brushed the hem of her cream-colored trousers, leaving a faint, wet streak of mud. The world seemed to tilt. The pressure of the board meeting, the repressed memories of a childhood spent in poverty, and the sheer arrogance of her position boiled over into a single reflexive motion. Clara didn't just step past him. She pulled back her foot and kicked the blue plastic cup. The sound was pathetic, a dull thwack of plastic against a shin, followed by the metallic ring of the 4 coins hitting the wet concrete. 1 quarter rolled toward the sewer grate. The nickel spun in a circle, singing a lonely, high-pitched note before falling flat. The sidewalk went silent. The tourists stopped. The doorman froze with his hand on the glass. The air became thick with the collective intake of breath from 20 different witnesses. Clara stood there, her chest heaving, the adrenaline of her cruelty making her fingertips tingle. She expected the man to yell. She expected him to cower. Instead, the next 30 seconds were unbelievable. Elias didn't look at the money. He didn't look at his bruised leg. He slowly reached into the pocket of his tattered coat and pulled out a small silver object. A locket, tarnished and dented. He held it out toward her in a trembling hand. "You dropped this," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering across a grave. 22 years ago. I've been sitting here every Tuesday, waiting for the girl who lost it to come back for her heart." Clara's hand went instinctively to her throat, to the space where a scar sat hidden beneath her silk scarf. The crowd gasped as the rich woman didn't walk away. She began to shake. The silence that followed the clatter of the coins was more deafening than the city's roar. It was a vacuum, a pocket of frozen time where the heartbeat of the metropolis seemed to stop. Clara stood paralyzed, her expensive leather bag heavy on her shoulder, feeling the weight of 1,000 judgmental eyes. But it was the man's eyes, those clouded gray orbs, that pinned her to the spot. He held the silver locket aloft. It was a cheap thing, the silver plating worn down to the brass beneath, shaped like a crooked heart. To anyone else it was trash. To Clara it was a ghost. The next 30 seconds, a voice whispered from the crowd, "Look at her face." Clara didn't look at the crowd. She couldn't. Her gaze was locked on the locket. Memories, suppressed under layers of corporate strategy and cold ambition, surged forward like a levee breaking. She saw a small kitchen with a leaking roof. She smelled the scent of sawdust and cheap peppermint. She heard the scraping of a violin bow against strings in the dead of winter to keep a little girl's spirits up. "You?" Clara's voice was a ragged shadow of its former authority. "How do you have that?" Elias didn't answer with words. Instead he did the unbelievable. He didn't reach for his scattered money. He didn't curse her. With a grace that defied his skeletal frame, he placed the locket on the dry patch of pavement he had been sitting on, then reached for his violin. The crowd pressed closer, a wall of umbrellas and raincoats forming a circle of witnesses. The doorman, who had been ready to intervene, stayed his hand. Elias tucked the scarred wood of the violin under his chin. The instrument looked like it had been through a war, cracked varnish, a bridge held together by hope, but as he drew the bow across the strings, the sound that emerged wasn't a screech. It was a cry. He played the melody he had been humming, but now it was full-bodied, haunting, and ancient. It was a lullaby called "The Star in the Well," a song Clara's father had written for her when she was 6 years old. He had told her that even in the deepest, darkest hole, you could find a reflection of the stars if you only looked up. The first 10 seconds of the music felt like a physical blow to Clara's chest. She felt her lungs constrict. The cold rain, which she had been so desperate to avoid, began to soak through her silk suit, but she didn't feel the chill. She felt the heat of shame. At 15 seconds, the unbelievable happened. Clara von Heisig, the woman known as the Iron Widow of real estate, dropped to her knees in the middle of the wet sidewalk. She didn't care about the mud ruining her $4,000 trousers. She didn't care about the onlookers filming on their iPhones. She reached out a trembling hand and picked up the locket. With a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence, she snapped it open. Inside was a tiny water-damaged photograph of a younger Elias, holding a toddler with a ribbon in her hair. At 20 seconds, Elias stopped playing. He looked at her, a single tear carving a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "I told you I'd wait, Clary," he whispered. "I told you that even if the world took everything else, it couldn't take the song." The crowd was motionless. A woman in the front row burst into tears. A businessman who had been complaining about his coffee froze, his mouth slightly open. They were witnessing the total disintegration of a persona. The rich woman was gone. In her place was a terrified, grieving child. At 25 seconds, Clara reached into the gutter. She didn't just pick up the quarters she had kicked. She scooped up the muck and the filth, desperate to retrieve every cent of the pittance she had treated with such disdain. Her hands were stained black with street grime, her manicured nails chipped against the concrete. At 30 seconds, she did the one thing no one expected. She didn't offer him a check. She didn't call an ambulance. She leaned forward and threw her arms around the old man's neck, burying her face in his damp, smelling coat. "Daddy," she sobbed, the word breaking out of her like a trapped bird. "I thought you died in the fire. They told me you were gone." The unbelievable wasn't just the reunion, it was the transformation. The woman who had kicked a beggar was now clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. The storm finally broke, a deluge of rain washing over them both, blurring the lines between the billionaire and the beggar until they were just two souls huddled together on a cold city street. The flashbulbs of smartphones continued to pop, a staccato rhythm against the steady drum of the rain. Clara remained on the ground, her forehead pressed against Elias's rough wool shoulder. The world of boardrooms, hostile takeovers, and luxury high-rises had vanished. In its place was the raw, jagged edges of 1998, the year the music stopped. "Get up, Miss von Heisig," a sharp voice cut through the emotional haze. Clara looked up, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale face. Standing over them was Marcus Thorne, her chief of operations and the man who handled the darker logistics of her empire. He held a wide black umbrella, his expression one of clinical disgust. Behind him, two security guards stood like statues, their presence a silent command for order. "The board is watching, Clara," Marcus hissed, leaning down so only she could hear. "The live stream of this spectacle is already hitting the news feeds. You're destroying the East Side acquisition. Get up, put on your mask, and let us handle this vagrant." "He's not a vagrant," Clara whispered, her voice gaining a cold, dangerous edge as she stood, though she didn't let go of Elias's hand. Her fingers were interlaced with his wealthy, soft skin meeting calloused, scarred knuckles. He's my father. Marcus's eyes flickered, but only for a second. Your father died in the tenement fire on 4th Street. You were the ward of the state. We've vetted your history 1,000 times, Clara. This is a con. This man is a professional grifter who has clearly done his homework. Elias stayed silent, but his grip on Clara's hand tightened. He looked at Marcus not with fear but with a weary recognition. I didn't do no homework, Elias said, his voice cracking. I just followed the song. I saw her on the news, that face, that same stubborn chin her mother had. I didn't want her money. I just wanted to see if she still had the locket. The fire, Elias, Clara said, ignoring Marcus entirely. The rain was drenching them now, turning the street into a river of gray. The social workers told me you never made it out of the basement unit. They said they found remains. Elias looked down at his violin case. The basement was a trap, Clary. When the beams came down, I got you out the window first. You remember? I told you to run to the corner store and wait. But the ceiling collapsed before I could follow. I woke up in a county hospital 3 months later with no name and a face full of bandages. By the time I could walk, you were gone. Lost in the system. They told me you'd been adopted by a family in another state. They told me you were better off without a crippled, penniless fiddler for a father. The tension in the air was palpable. The crowd had grown, but the noise had dropped to a murmur. This was no longer a scene of a rich woman kicking a beggar. It was a slow-motion car crash of a family's stolen history. Marcus stepped forward, his hand reaching for Clara's arm. This is enough. Security, remove this man. He's trespassing on private property. Don't touch him. Clara barked. The sound was so sharp it made the guards flinch. She turned to Marcus, her eyes narrowed. You said you vetted my history 1,000 times. If you did, you would have found the hospital records. You would have found the missing persons report filed by an Elias Vance in 2002. Why didn't I ever see those files, Marcus? Marcus's face remained a mask of corporate indifference, but a small muscle in his jaw twitched. We protected you from distractions, Clara. Your success depended on your focus. On your detachment. The realization hit Clara like a physical weight. Her rise to the top hadn't been an accident of merit alone. It had been curated. The people around her had pruned her family tree until only she remained, isolated and easier to control. They had turned her into a weapon of industry by making her believe she was alone in the world. How much did you pay the social workers? Clara asked, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm level. Or was it simpler than that? Did you just bury the mail? Did you burn the letters he sent to the agency? Elias pulled a small, tattered bundle of envelopes from the bottom of his violin case, wrapped in a piece of plastic. They were stained, unaddressed, and never sent, because he never had an address to send them to. But they were dated. Every year on her birthday for 22 years. I wrote them anyway, Elias whispered. Just to keep the words alive. The unbelievable 30 seconds had turned into a trial on the sidewalk. Clara looked at the letters, then at the man she had kicked only minutes ago. The stakes were no longer about a board meeting or a real estate deal. The stakes were her soul. If she walked into that building now, she would secure her billions, but she would be cementing the lie that had defined her life. If she stayed, she would lose the empire she had spent her life building. Marcus checked his watch. 30 seconds, Clara. The vote is happening. Walk away from this old man, and we can spin this as a charity encounter. Stay here, and the board will vote you out for mental instability by the time the elevator hits the penthouse. Clara looked at the silver locket in her muddy hand. She looked at Elias, who was trembling in the cold, not asking for a dime, only looking at her with the same love he had shown when she was a 6-year-old in a burning building. The subtext of the silence was clear. Marcus represented the gold and Elias represented the blood. You're right, Marcus, Clara said, slowly reaching out to take the violin case from the ground. My focus has been wrong for a long time. She turned to the crowd, her voice projecting with the power that had made her a titan of industry. My name is Clara Vance. And I'm going home. But as she turned to lead Elias away, Marcus made a final desperate move. He signaled the guards. The man is a threat to the CEO. Detain him. The guards moved in and the tension reached its breaking point. The unbelievable story was about to take its most dramatic turn yet. The air crackled as the 2 security guards stepped forward, their heavy boots splashing through the puddles. They were large men trained to see the world in terms of assets and threats. To them, Elias was a threat to the image of the corporation. To Clara they were the final wall between her and the truth. "I said do not touch him," Clara commanded. She stepped in front of Elias, shielding his frail body with her own. The contrast was staggering. The titan of industry, draped in ruined silk and soaked to the bone, standing as a human shield for a man the world had discarded. Marcus Thorne didn't flinch. "Clara, you're hyperventilating. You're having a breakdown. For your own safety and the safety of the shareholders, we are removing the catalyst of your distress." He nodded to the guards. "Take him. Gently if he cooperates. Forcefully if he doesn't." As the guards reached for Elias's thin arms, the old man didn't fight. He simply looked at Clara, a calm, steady gaze that seemed to say he had survived much worse than this. But Clara wasn't the little girl from the fire anymore. "If you touch him," Clara said, her voice vibrating with a cold, crystalline fury, "I will dismantle every board member's portfolio before the sun sets. I built this empire. I know where the foundations are cracked. I know about the East Side offshore accounts, Marcus. I know about the expediting fees you paid to the city council." Marcus froze. The guards hesitated, looking between the CEO and the chief of operations. The power dynamic shifted in a heartbeat. The crowd held its collective breath. Even the rain seemed to dampen its noise as the corporate mask finally shattered. "You wouldn't," Marcus whispered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "You'd destroy yourself." "I was destroyed 22 years ago," Clara countered, stepping closer until she was inches from his face. "You just spent the last decade dressing up the ruins. I'd rather be a daughter on the street than a queen in a castle built on my father's grave." She turned back to Elias and took his hand. "Come on, Dad. We're leaving." "Clara," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "The vote. You're throwing away a billion-dollar legacy for a man who hasn't held a job in 20 years. Clara stopped. She looked up at the towering glass monolith of Platinum Plaza, the building she had designed to be her legacy. It looked cold. It looked empty. She looked down at the silver locket in her palm, the only true inheritance she had ever received. "My legacy isn't in the steel, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying to the very back of the crowd. "It's in the song." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her company ID, the card that gave her access to every vault, every secret, and every floor. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it into the sewer grate where her coins had rolled earlier. The unbelievable climax wasn't a fight, it was a surrender. A surrender of the fake life for the real one. But as they began to walk away, a voice erupted from the crowd. It was the doorman. He began to clap. Then a woman in a business suit joined in. Then a teenager with a backpack. Within seconds, a roar of applause rose up from the sidewalk, drowning out the sound of the traffic. The people weren't cheering for the billionaire, they were cheering for the woman who had finally found her way home. Marcus stood alone under his umbrella, a small, shrinking figure against the backdrop of the empire he had tried to steal. Clara leaned into Elias, feeling the warmth of his presence. "Where do we go, Clary?" he asked softly, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. "I don't have a palace for you." Clara looked at the muddy quarters in her hand and then at her father's violin. She smiled, a genuine tear-filled smile that hadn't touched her lips since she was 6 years old. "We go wherever the music takes us, Dad. But first we're getting you a dry coat." The climax reached its peak as they walked away from the lights of the plaza, two silhouettes blending into the gray mist of the city, no longer a rich woman and a beggar but a father and a daughter, finally on the same side of the glass. The penthouse of the Platinum Plaza remained dark that night, but a few miles away in a small, brightly lit diner that smelled of grease and rain, the world felt right for the first time in 2 decades. Clara sat across from Elias in a vinyl booth, her ruined silk jacket draped over the back of the seat. She had traded her $3,000 shoes for a pair of $5 rubber flip-flops she'd bought at a convenience store on the way. Elias was wrapped in a thick, oversized fleece blanket the diner waitress had brought him. He was nursing a bowl of tomato soup, his hands still shaking slightly but his eyes were clear. The silver locket sat on the table between them, nestled next to a plate of grilled cheese, the same meal they used to share on Saturday nights when the world was small and safe. "I didn't think you'd remember the song," Elias whispered, his voice gaining strength. "I never forgot it, Dad," Clara replied, her voice soft but firm. "I just tried to drown it out with the sound of money. I thought if I climbed high enough I'd be able to see you again. I didn't realize I was just walking further away from the ground where you were waiting." The resolution of Clara's life didn't involve a return to the corporate throne. In the days that followed, the board moved to replace her, citing her public instability. They expected her to fight, to sue, to cling to her shares. Instead, she did something that stunned the financial world. She liquidated her personal holdings, kept enough to ensure a comfortable life for her and her father, and funneled the rest into the Vance Foundation, an organization dedicated to finding the families of invisible people living on the streets. The news of the millionaire who chose her father stayed in the headlines for weeks, but Clara stopped reading them. She had better things to do. 6 months later, the sun was shining over a refurbished community center in the East Side, the very district Clara had once planned to bulldoze for luxury condos. Now it was a music school for children who lived below the poverty line. Clara stood in the wings of the small stage, watching as Elias, dressed in a clean linen suit, tuned his violin. He wasn't sitting on a cardboard mat anymore. He was standing tall, a teacher, a mentor, and a man whose dignity had been restored not by gold but by recognition. As he began to play the opening notes of The Star in the Well, Clara felt a hand on her shoulder. It was the doorman from Platinum Plaza, whom she had hired to run the center's security. He gave her a silent nod of respect, the kind of respect she had never been able to buy with her billions. Clara looked at her hands. They were no longer stained with street grime, but they weren't the hands of a cold mogul either. They were the hands of a daughter who had finally learned how to hold on to what mattered. She had lost an empire, but she had gained her soul. The unbelievable 30 seconds on that rainy sidewalk hadn't just changed her afternoon, they had rewritten her destiny. She realized now that wealth wasn't the balance in her bank account, it was the ability to look a stranger in the eye and see a human being, and the courage to kick down the walls of pride to find the love waiting on the other side. As the final note of the violin faded into the warm afternoon air, Elias looked toward the wings and winked. Clara smiled back, a tear of pure joy tracing a path down her cheek. They were home. The end. Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey. What did you think of Clara's choice to leave her empire behind for her father? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us what city or country you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community.